August 8th, 1975, 1 in the morning. Henan Province, China. The Banqiao Dam holds. And it doesn't. The entire reservoir, 600 million cubic meters of water, releases in a matter of minutes into the valley below. The flood wave is 10 kilometers wide, 3 to 7 meters high. It moves faster than anyone in its path can run. It travels through villages that have had no warning, through towns whose telegraph lines were already destroyed by the storm, through a landscape where by this point 62 other dams have also failed in the same 24 hours. The official death toll the Chinese government announced in 1975 was 26,000 people. The actual number, based on internal government assessments, finally made public decades later, was somewhere between 170,000 and 230,000. And for 20 years, the People's Republic of China told the world it had never happened. The dam had a name that should have been a warning sign. The Chinese called it the Iron Dam because it was impossible to break, because it was Soviet designed, because it had been built with the full force of the communist state behind it, and communist engineering did not fail. The engineer who had serious doubts about that was named Chen Xing. He was one of China's most experienced hydrological engineers. He had studied the entire Ru River watershed and concluded that the dam network was dangerously overcrowded. Too many dams on the same river system, not enough capacity for a truly severe flood. Chen Xing was labeled a rightist. He was removed from the project. The dam was completed on schedule. The Iron Dam was declared safe. In August 1975, Super Typhoon Nina delivered 1,060 millimeters of rainfall in 24 hours to the region above it. The dam had been designed to handle 300. Three things about the Banqiao disaster that explain why 170,000 deaths were successfully hidden for 20 years. The first, the telecommunications infrastructure across the affected region was destroyed by the typhoon before the dams failed. The villages downstream received no warning because there was no functional way to send one. Local officials had tried to contact higher authorities in the days before the failure, warning that the water levels were reaching critical thresholds. Many of those messages never arrived. The ones that did arrive prompted decisions to release water from some reservoirs, decisions taken too late in the wrong sequence that destabilized downstream dams rather than relieving pressure on the system. The second, the government's decision to classify the disaster was driven partly by ideology and partly by the specific political moment. August 1975 was one of the most turbulent periods of the Cultural Revolution. Chairman Mao was alive but declining. The Gang of Four held enormous power. Reporting a catastrophic failure of socialist engineering on this scale was genuinely dangerous for anyone whose name appeared on the associated paperwork. Silence was not just politically convenient. For some officials, it was self-preservation. The third, the information did not become widely available even within China until 2005, when a Chinese magazine published findings based on newly accessible internal government documents. A comprehensive account had been published in a limited circulation internal report in the 1980s. It was never publicly released. The families of the dead lived in proximity to the disaster sites, rebuilt their lives, and raised children who had often been told only partial truths about what had happened to their relatives in August 1975. The context in which the Banqiao Dam was built is essential to understanding why it was built the way it was. China in the early 1950s was undertaking an enormous program of dam construction across its major river systems. Inspired partly by Soviet engineering expertise and partly by a political determination to demonstrate that socialist planning could control nature in ways that capitalist systems could not. Dams were not merely infrastructure. They were ideological statements. The speed and scale of their construction was itself a form of political proof. The Ru River watershed in Henan Province was part of this broader program. Multiple dams were built in rapid succession, creating a network of water control structures across the watershed that was intended to provide both flood control and irrigation for the surrounding agricultural land. Chen Xing, who had been involved in the early planning of this network, grew increasingly concerned as the program expanded that the total number of dams being placed on the watershed exceeded what the system's hydrology could safely handle in an extreme flood event. His concern was specifically about the cascading failure risk, that if one major dam failed, the released water would overwhelm the next dam downstream, which would also fail, releasing water into the one after that. This concern was not welcome. In the political climate of the early 1950s, expressing doubt about the capacity of Chinese engineering to handle any eventuality was professionally and personally risky. Chen Xing was eventually removed from the project and effectively sidelined from further major engineering work. His specific warnings about the Banqiao system were filed and not acted upon. The dam was completed and was, in normal operational terms, an impressive piece of engineering. For 2 decades, it functioned as designed, providing flood control and irrigation benefits to the region. The failure mode, Chen Xing had identified a flood event exceeding the design parameters by a large enough margin to overwhelm the entire network simultaneously, never arose during those 2 decades. In August 1975, it did. Super Typhoon Nina had tracked across the Philippines and Taiwan before making landfall on the Chinese coast, losing some of its ocean-fed intensity but still carrying an extraordinary amount of moisture. As it moved inland over Henan Province and interacted with the blocking high-pressure system that prevented it from moving further, it stalled. For several days, the storm system sat nearly motionless over the Ru River watershed, dropping rainfall that meteorological records later established was among the highest ever recorded in China for that region in any comparable time period. The Banqiao Dam, together with the nearby Shimantan Dam, both failed in the early hours of August 8th. The cascade that Chen Xing had predicted began immediately. Dam after dam failed, downstream as floodwaters added to floodwaters, each failure amplifying the next. By the time the chain of failures was complete, 62 separate dams had given way in roughly 24 hours. The flood wave that spread across the agricultural plains of Hunan was not a river flooding its banks. It was the collected contents of dozens of reservoirs, released simultaneously, spreading across flat land with no natural channels to contain it, covering an area of hundreds of square kilometers to depths of several meters. The specific experience of the flood's arrival in the villages downstream of the dam has been reconstructed from survivor accounts collected in the years after the disaster, primarily in the period after information about it began to become more openly accessible in China. These accounts describe a consistent sequence. People asleep in their homes, a sound described variously as thunder or a roaring, and then the arrival of water and darkness at a speed and volume that gave no meaningful opportunity to respond. Some villages were simply gone, not damaged, not partially flooded, but erased within minutes of the flood wave's arrival. The width of the wave, 10 kilometers across in places, meant that the margins of the valley provided no safe high ground for most of the people in its path. The duration of the flooding extended far beyond the initial wave. The collapse of 62 dams over 24 hours meant that water continued arriving in the flood zone for an extended period. Land that might have offered temporary refuge was covered progressively as more reservoir contents arrived. The agricultural plains of Henan, flat and extensive, held the water for days and in some areas weeks, creating conditions of ongoing danger for survivors trying to reach higher ground, and creating the conditions for the disease outbreaks that compounded the initial death toll in the weeks that followed. The communities in the flood's path had, in most cases, no warning at all. The telephone and telegraph lines that connected the region had been taken down by the typhoon before the dams began to fail. Local officials, who had been trying to communicate the severity of the water levels, had been unable to get through to higher authorities in the final critical hours. People were asleep in their homes at 1 a.m. when the water arrived. The scale of death in the immediate flood was enormous, but the disaster did not end with the flood itself. The agricultural land across a vast area of Henan was contaminated, infrastructure was destroyed, and the displacement of millions of people created conditions of disease and starvation in the weeks and months that followed. Internal government assessments compiled in the aftermath calculated the direct flood deaths alongside deaths from subsequent disease and famine, arriving at total figures that dwarfed the initial death count. The official death toll, announced in 1975, was 26,000. This number was derived by counting only the most immediately verifiable casualties and was, from the beginning, a significant undercount. Later internal assessments, more carefully compiled as the government worked to understand the scale of the failure and plan the reconstruction of the region, placed the direct flood deaths alone at over 85,000, with additional deaths from disease and starvation bringing the total to figures ranging from 171,000 to as high as 230,000 in different assessments. The reconstruction program for the affected areas of Henan began within weeks of the disaster and continued for years, involving the relocation and rebuilding of communities across a large area. The new dams built to replace the failed ones were constructed to substantially higher specifications, incorporating design parameters for rainfall events that the old structures had been unable to handle. The engineering lessons of the disaster were absorbed and applied, as they so often are, immediately after the worst had already happened, rather than before. Chen Xing, who had been removed from the project for warning that it was dangerous, was eventually rehabilitated professionally as the political climate shifted in the post-Mao period. He returned to active engineering work and continued to publish on flood control and dam safety for decades. The rehabilitation of discredited experts following the end of the Cultural Revolution was part of a broader reassessment of the period, though it came too late for the Banqiao disaster itself. These figures remain classified. The disaster was not acknowledged publicly in Chinese media. Outside China, almost nothing was known. A combination of China's general information isolation during the period and the practical reality that a typhoon-related disaster in a rural Chinese province in 1975 would have generated limited international attention even without deliberate suppression. The first substantial public account appeared in a Chinese publication in 2005, 30 years after the event, based on internal government documents that had become available as China's information environment gradually opened over the preceding decade. By then, the survivors had rebuilt their communities. The dams had been replaced with new structures built to higher specifications, and most of the rest of the world was learning about the disaster for the first time. Chen Xing lived until 2005. He saw his warnings finally vindicated. He did not see anyone held accountable for having dismissed them. The dam site today is occupied by new infrastructure built after the disaster, including a rebuilt dam with substantially higher safety specifications. The area around it is used for agriculture and settlement, as it was before 1975. There is a memorial to the victims of the disaster. The scale of what happened there is acknowledged in a limited way in local and regional commemoration. The national and international acknowledgement of the Banqiao disaster has never fully caught up to the scale of the event. A consequence of 20 years of effective information suppression that left a gap in global historical awareness that has not been entirely filled in the decades since the suppression ended. If you want to understand the disasters where the death toll was a political decision as much as a factual, one, where the number a government announced had less to do with the dead than with what the government could afford to admit. Subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight